Hello everyone, today we introduce the reign of Alexios I Komnenos, ruling as Byzantine Emperor from 1081 to 1118. I already made a video about the rise of Alexios Komnenos. Today we will repeat in part that, but as a summary, right? We've seen the initial struggles against the Pechenegs, the Normans. I also made multiple videos on the Komnenian dynasty, not just other emperors' reigns videos, but a general overview on the period that, as you know, is one of the most important in Byzantine history. The empire achieves one of its peaks, right? And especially in this relentless competition with the West and other foes. Of course, today we concentrate also on the latter aspect concerning the relations entertained by Constantinople with Venice and the Crusaders, right, including the Normans that, as you know, were essentially the most dangerous threat to the unity of the empire. That, in fact, Alexios rose to the throne to essentially curb, right, to trying to stem in the what was the declared intention of Robert Guiscard of conquering the same Constantinople, one of the many times in which, in fact, the Byzantine capital could concretely fall had things gone in a slightly different way, right? And we have observed in the aforementioned video about the rise of Alexios how at his rise on the throne, the situation in the empire was practically desperate, right? Almost all of Anatolia had fallen into the hands of the Seljuks, that after the Battle of Manzikert, as you know, had basically taken over the entire hinterland and had been arriving to the Aegean, like the Byzantines controlled the story, say, in a more consistent way, the coastal centers that the Turks often did not have the Poliorcetic capacity to storm. Yet the loss of the hinterland was particularly important for the empire as its historical basis for the Tagmata recruitment, where manpower had basically gone. Plus, in a geographical sense, this made the Turks very close to Constantinople. Right. This time also the Pechenegs, another Turkic population from the steppes, had settled themselves on the right bank of the Danube, so within probably the boundaries of Romania, and the Normans, right, from southern Italy, were on the move to directly attack the Byzantine territory. The latter, as we said before, were by far the most dangerous among all these foes, right, and they would remain in general. The Normans had established a veritable realm with the papal blessing in southern Italy and in Sicily, which gave them a tremendous advantage as far as the control of the central Mediterranean was concerned. We'll see later how this was. Of course, we would never make too many. I made a video about Norman Sicily, but never, for some odd reason, really gone too much in depth with it, but you have an idea of the historical, other than just the political or strategical implications of the establishment of the Siculo-Norman kingdom, which was again a terrific launch pad for attacking Constantinople. Right, the coastal centers of southern Italy provided the Normans with an important naval power, supplied also stiffened by the support of, for example, the Genoese, and as we will see now, the conquest of centers like Corfu, right, and Dyrrhachium was pivotal to be able to threaten places like Thessaly, the same Constantinople. Robert Guiscard, the leader of the Normans of southern Italy, after the establishment of its own regional power, directly, immediately aggressed Constantinople. We're talking May of 1081, he occupied the aforementioned Corfu, and he launched the siege of Dyrrhachium. Recently I made a video about the Varangians that on that occasion were actually crushed in the battle was fought outside the city. Right among them there were also many Anglo-Saxons who had fled to Constantinople after the Norman conquest of England. The same contacts between England, Normandy, and southern Italy being strong at this point, the Norman threat was really a mortal danger for the survival of the Byzantine Empire. Again, Guiscard had been very clear about his political and strategical intention, the conquest of Constantinople. Thus, Alexios, that, as we've seen, did not have immediately many resources, that had been eroded, had been eaten up by a process of great, in fact, of decline, or rate of crisis, that was the one that the Komnenians would invert, like there is here. We don't talk about how he rose to power, strictly speaking, nor how, say, important the political choices of the Komnenians in the longer run were to essentially put an end to the old ideal of the centralized bureaucratic state of the permanent national army, whatever. There was an incredible degree of privatization of emergential measures, such as the ones enacted by Alexios immediately at this point, to find really the means to oppose himself to essentially one of the greatest powers of the Mediterranean at that point. Among these measures there was, by the way, the confiscation of some ecclesiastical properties. These are just to cash quickly, which was always useful, especially considering the multitude of mercenaries, including same Western ones, by the way, that were around the Eastern Mediterranean at this point, and also recurring to some still functioning and typically Byzantine weapon, that is diplomatic activity. Admittedly, every people was skilled at that, but really Constantinople had, an enormous tradition and sort of also the cultural capacity in terms of ethnography, broader contact, like moral hegemony in many surrounding populations to know properly the character, the spirits of his enemies. In October 1081, however, the Siculo-Normans defeated heavily at Dyrrhachium the army led by the same Alexios, and shortly afterwards they in fact took over the same city that surrendered, having lost hopes of being being resupplied, being saved. And the Normans pushed as far as Thessaly, that, as you know, is properly in the Aegean watershed, pretty agricultural area, with Thessaloniki also embodying a bit like the only other great urban center after Constantinople that had historically also some autonomistic ambitions, but that served greatly like the Byzantine capacity of uniting, like the Aegean traffics and more. However, and I discussed this in the video again about the rise of Alexios, like if these how he coped with the Normans specifically, the Byzantines managed to engulf, to bog down the Normans into guerrilla, right? That entailed like a big deal, yes, of course, of destructions even across Thessaly and more. This was carried out also by co-opting some of the aforementioned Pechenegs that were always in for looting, right? And even if at the end of the day, like it was a Byzantine population that was being targeted, those resources lost would have been subtracted temporarily to the Normans that really were risking to make the entire, like everything basically west of Constantinople or almost was lost, right? This is really typical, like just in many aspects of Byzantine history, that the real center of Byzantine civilization is the city. It is not to say just Constantinople, that objectively by this point had been subsuming pretty much all the rest. I just mentioned Thessalonica because it was really the only true outer city, the others being, towns in many ways, in comparison to the capital. And so, yes, you can lose even the interland to some extent, but as long as you own those essentially ports, those the end of the valleys, right, that lead to the Aegean, you have still a grip on the hinterland when the invaders have passed or also have settled in part. Naturally, the Normans were not like a nomadic population; they were civilized and all, so they were to leave, and this is essentially what would happen. There was admittedly a lot of sort of back and forths and strategically between the Byzantines and the Normans, but in 1085, Robert Guiscard died, and his troops withdrew. Thus, the Byzantines won. Right. There was, however, a very important protagonist in all this, not on land but at sea, that rendered such Byzantine victory possible, and asking for quite a compensation. As you have probably understood, we're talking about Venice, that had provided really a crucial naval support to Constantinople, leading to enormous concessions we will analyze now by Alexios. So, a minimal background. In the 11th century, we will talk more about Venetian history because we haven't done it in a long time, but to make the long story short, just in this video, the city had by now, right, reached the complete independence, right, de facto, right. It was historically a part of the Byzantine Empire, but of course a very decentralized one in the very northwestern corner, in fact, of the Byzantine projectional capabilities that at this point did not include any capacity to retake Venice, that is built over some lagoon islands, so you literally can't conquer this, especially at this point when you are the one who needs the Venetian fleet, right? Because you don't quite have one. And in any case, the Byzantine diplomacy, of course, was very conservative, and it would, just because of obvious interest, continue to indicate Venice formally as if it had been under the dominion of Constantinople. The autonomy from the empire had not, however, broken the political ties between the Venetians and the Byzantines. After all, as we just observed, the former knew that they were de facto independent, so why losing that opportunity in such, a powerful ally, after all? Especially when it is in such a desperate need to be willing to offer you so much, right? There was this traditional alliance, right? There had been also contrasts already by this point for many reasons that we'll hopefully explore in a dedicated video, because everybody starts talking about Venice and Constantinople just like essentially from this time, from the crucible of Alexios. But of course there was a prior, history that deserves much more attention than the one it's normally credited, especially during the 10th century. But already starting from the 9th, the relations between Venice and the Carolingians in the age of the Macedonian revival as well, and so how cleverly the Venetians had bargained their own independence by being essentially between the two empires. Plus, of course, and we have made lots of videos about that instead, like the general, properly the Italian hegemony at this point on Mediterranean traffics that Venice embodied at the top, right, in relative terms, the most powerful of the maritime republics, etc. So, and this had been built even politically and strategically, sometimes at the expense of the Byzantine Empire. For example, we've seen it in the video about videos about medieval Croatia, all right, how the Venetians had affirmed their own supremacy on parts of Dalmatia, that was historically imperial territory, and eliminating, by the way, in the process, that's another very important topic, the centuries-old threat of the Slavic piracy. Now, at the time of Alexios I, the relations between Constantinople and Venice had really a very important turn, right? Venice essentially took on a central role in the probably strategic defense of the empire, right? That, as we pointed out before, was fundamentally based on a coastal dimension, and given the pretty thorough state of the imperial navy, it really required a substitute for that. The Venetians represented the finest, right, of this, because again they had the best crews, the best admirals, the best ships, and in the world, debatably. So this is what surely Mediterranean. This is what, of course, especially considering the proximity, in fact, seemed so advantageous between the alliance of these two, these two polities that had, in a way, been part of a broader past. When, in fact, Robert Guiscard had besieged Dyrrhachion in Epirus, Alexios, given that he really had no satisfactory forces to cope with the enemy on his own, requested the naval help of Venice, which is a big deal for a siege that is carried out also from the sea, right? And Venice was actually stronger already than the Normans, but of course it wasn't like a full, let's say, hegemony or absolute control of the seas. The Venetian intervention at Dyrrhachium had to be, in any case, indispensable, given that, again, the Byzantine fleet had been reduced to a very poor thing, and surely inadequate to cope with the Norman military apparatus that really from Sicily, from southern Italy, was really based on a massive infrastructural capacity, lots of agricultural resources, manpower, technical capacities, again, shipyards, etc. The Normans had imported essentially a Western Frankish feudalism that would choke on the long run what was actually the nascent history of the southern Italian maritime republics. I made a video about Amalfi, that, as you know, among the traditional Italian maritime republics was actually the first, right, and the for a time, in fact, the most important, and that eventually was surrounded by the Normans, and even when taken, like, yes, it maintained an importance, but say not as the same that the much more autonomous communes of central northern Italy, like Pisa, Genoa, and St. Venice, would have. So from and this is important because the St. Normans at a point required, for example, the Genoese, even though they had this great coastal potential, right, on their own, maritime resources, they subcontracted to the Genoese, to the Pisans, and I made an important reference to this, in fact, in the videos I made on the single cities described now. Naturally, from the Venetian side, there was a remarkable overlapping of interest because the threat posed by the potential settlement of the Normans on both sides of the Adriatic Sea, so controlling the Otranto Strait between Italy and the Balkans, was seen as, of course, an existential danger for the Venetian liberty of navigation. And this is pretty much the policy that Venice follows throughout its entire history, trying to break apart whoever would gain control basically on both sides of the Adriatic. It would happen with the Angevins. There is, it's a very clear, Venetian vision, right, as far as her interests were concerned, and also, again, an incredibly aggressive-minded attitude regarding anything concerned, right? And this also unity in the capacity of strategic projection, etc. That has to do, in fact, also with these long ties with Constantinople, the logistics involved for connecting, in fact, Venice with the rest of Mediterranean. And in 1081, the Venetian fleet at the command of the Doge, which is a term, as you know, like from the highest office of the magistracy of the Venetian Republic, coming from dux, right? So you can see there the Byzantine past in the title. Domenico Selvo reached Dyrrhachion, managing to break the Siculo-Norman blockade, and even after, in spite of the consistent defeat suffered at sea, we do not know exactly where, whether at Corfu or some other places on the on the coastal side of Epirus, basically in 1084, at the hands of the same Siculo-Normans, a defeat suffered together with part of what remained of the Byzantine imperial navy, in fact, kept cooperating with the empire up to the end of the war. That shows, of course, also how the Siculo-Normans had an important seaborne capacity, to say the least. We will see it now better also during the First Crusade. In any case, the Venetian intervention was incredibly important in this entire balance of powers. Venice was thus rewarded by Alexios in May 1082. So when, as you understand, the war was still going on, which shows also like the anxiety, of course, of the Byzantines to ensure a steady support from the Italian Republic. The sovereign issued, this is really a turning point, it's one of the most important dates in events in medieval history, the Chrysobulla, one of the many. The term comes from chrysos, which is gold, which is, of course, because the imperial seal was golden, right? And the edict provided with this, the bulla, was thus called Chrysobulla, in favor, in fact, of the allied city, to which the Byzantines granted wide privileges, consisting in actually a lot of stuff, right? It's not just commercial connected. It is mostly commercial trade rights, right? And privileges and immunities of some kind. But there is something more. Like there is the idea that the Venetians are getting some sort of even a foothold properly in the nobiliar hierarchy of the empire, right? Which is something that, again, the Byzantines were not happy at all doing, because the Venetians already looked like, say, the unreliable Latins that wanted just to profit, like of course, from the typically xenophobic and partly justified Byzantine mentality. But like probably noble titles that really reflect the place that Venice has in the empire now. For example, the same Doge and the Patriarch of Venice are provided with these titles. They're given a lot of money. We're talking about landed assets, as well as advantages in the exercise of trade, of course, and the scale of this is, let's say, motivated only by the context of desperation in which the empire literally found itself at that point. The Doge obtained just perpetually, right, the aulic dignity of Proto-Sevastus. Now, this title is quite meaningful because it means essentially the preeminent of the Augusti, right? So essentially the Doge himself was being elevated to a court title that was normally, as is typical of the Komnenian era, because basically Alexios I, and I talked about this in in the aforementioned video, because there is literally a reform of the honors, right, at court, had established, right, to compensate for the devaluation of the older ones, but affirming properly a sort of familiar private clanic control of the entire empire. Being a protosevastos meant that you were also paid regularly for that dignity, while to the Patriarch of Grado, that, as you know, was the original northeastern patriarchate, right, of Aquileia, that historically the Longobards had conquered, and the story goes that Venice would have been founded at that point by the inhabitants of the city that had fled to, in fact, the lagoons, to Grado, that is, in that sense, connected with the Byzantines, with Venice later on. The Patriarch of Grado received the same conditions of rank of Eupertimos, which is, I think, something like the most honorable in Greek, right? That was historically given to the clergy, to the prelates, that the sovereign of Constantinople intended to honor, in fact, in a particular way, right? So there is an aura of golden, splendor around these titles. It is just like how the Byzantines made everything. In fact, if you really look at the Basilica of St. Mark in the same Venice, you can appreciate those Byzantine styles in all their splendors, besides all the stuff that the Venetians sacked from Constantinople directly in 1204. That's another story. But it began here, because this is the moment in which basically the toxic relationship between the Venetians and Constantinople got to a point of non-return, right? And because they couldn't really do without Venice, right? If they wanted a naval protection, a seaborne capacity, it was just on the Venetians, or actually other Italians, because at some point when they got fed up with the Venetians, they called in the peasants or the Genoese, depending on their rivalries among the Italian maritime powers, but still becoming ever more addicted and dependent on them. So this dispensation of nobiliar titles was not a novelty for the Venetian leaders, right? Because actually they had already been invested by Constantinople with some of the same. So the usage naturally was part of the Byzantine diplomatic tradition. It aimed specifically at creating links between the imperial court specifically and the either subject or allied leaders of some sort. And this character intensifies during the Komnenians, that again is essentially bail out again from that sort of statal mentality, start privatizing everything. So even though they wouldn't reach the levels of Western feudalism, they sort of had also a more dynastic way of coping with personal connections and powerful rulers abroad in a very personal sense. So in the Chrysobull of 1082, there were, however, also very strong novelties compared to the past. First of, and reflecting what we just said about the dynastic profile of the Komnenian era, because, for example, that title of Protosevastos was hereditary, right? It had essentially to pass from a doge to another, which incidentally was not how even the doge succeeded one another in Venice. Those were elected, right? But in the Byzantine view, and this is to tell you in many ways how that sort of older Roman system was eroded, right? It's actually an autonomistic polity like Venice, de facto becoming independent from the empire, has actually one of the most republican forms of government, while literally the Byzantine emperor is dispensating sort of dynastic official titles connected in theory with the same court, right? With the same Komnenian dynasty. It's sort of weird, and but it gives you the dimension of how much the East and the West, the Latins and the Greeks differed, right? And they had always, telling the truth, but the very peculiar ways the Byzantines had evolved, like, you know, the difference was even more accentuated. And by the way, consider this, that in the normal Byzantine praxis, the title itself of Proto-Sevastos was not hereditary proper, because not even for Constantinople it was, like, say, possible officially to just establish a ruling dynasty, right? Because the old concept of the empire was sort of much more meritocratic in theory. De facto, the Komnenians, as you know, are a dynasty, and they do pass their power, like, from father to son. This had been the case also for the Macedonians, for others, right? But like, in theory, in principle, not even the Byzantine emperor could manage, like, this limit, right? This threshold within the same Byzantine culture was extremely conservative in that regard. But it could be a bit more innovative with at least things that were happening, at least with foreigners, even though the Venetians, again, in theory, in fact, according to that same extreme conservatism, was conceived as being part of the empire. Something that did not really, like, one thing is, I don't know, China doing that with Taiwan because they literally want to annexate it. Right here, it's just purely, like, formal. Like, the idea that if you were a Byzantine, there was no other way that thing was possible. Even at this point, of course, you were, completely incapable to even think when historically you could have ever reconquered Venice or whatever. In any case, when say the Doge was placed, this is to say how desperate the Byzantines were really to gain the Venetian help, on the same level of the imperial family. Again, it was a proto-Sevastos, not even just Sevastos, it's proto-Sevastos. The same dignity had been conferred also to the brother and brother-in-law of Alexios I. Such concessions, by the way, would have been impossible to be made to a power, to an institution that was conceived outside of the same Byzantine Empire, right? You couldn't, say, elevate to Proto-Sevastos just a random guy, out there in Francia or in Russia, right? You had at least to have some parental ties, and the fact that Venice was a part of the empire conceptually was a way of saying, well, that's a way of co-opting technically something that would belong to us, right? Naturally, at this point, the Komnenians are just the top of the oligarchs that run the empire. So the broader sense of course, also the latter were also the problem, like the potential rebels and whatever. But was not much was saying that the people overall had, right, in this matters. They hated the Latins, by the way, right, and this Chrysobulla also led, as we'll see now, to quite important tensions overall. The money that was spent, the salaries for the Doge and the Patriarch, they entailed up to 20 pounds of gold every year, right? The Venetians could distribute this gold at their own discretion in their own churches. Every Amalfitan, owner of a shop of Constantinople or in other territories of the empire, had to pay every year 3 golden coins to the Church of St. Mark in Venice, which meant that essentially they had to pay this tax every year within the empire that favored Venice, and that was instead penalizing this, as we've seen, the center that was fundamentally within the orbit of the Siculo-Norman kingdom, and as such, like there wasn't technically a kingdom yet, but I mean de facto, and the sense was, of course, keeping those guys, those specific competitors, out, because they were normally supporting the enemy, or they were just competitors in the Eastern Mediterranean for Venice. The Byzantines had probably the capacity to enforce this on the Amalfitan shop owners that were there, together with actually lots of other non-Venetian Italians in the empire. By the way, the landed concessions entailed Constantinople and Dyrrhachium. The latter also to, again, fostered like a Venetian presence that could prevent other attempts from the side of the Siculo-Normans to aggress the most important city in Epirus. In Constantinople, the Venetians obtained a quarter along the Golden Horn, that, as you know, is the natural port of Constantinople. This essentially this gulf that enters quite widely, surpasses eventually the same city in the hinterland, right? And that had like on the other side, properly of Constantinople, another city de facto, and this quarter entailed 3 maritime docks, an oven next to the church of St. Asindinus that had to be Venetian property, with all the rents, the income that came from that. In Dyrrhachium, the church of St. Andrew, with the pertinence of the same, that the churches had property beyond the church, except for the material that was stocked for the specific use of the imperial fleet. So those properly Byzantine, non-Venetian ships belonged to the Venetians now. The economic privileges finally entailed the faculty of selling or buying literally every kind of goods without paying any tax. Big deal, right? This shows you, right, essentially the extent of Venetian privilege in Constantinople. The Venetians were properly exempt from the imperial jurisdiction of the maritime functionaries, so they couldn't, for example, avoid being, like, nobody could confiscate their goods for any reason. Like they were, again, prepotently having this, also because, again, the Italian quarters were pretty much fortified, armed. Like they were not, like, they often also fought against one another. So this was a sort of occupation, telling the truth. It shows you the point to which the empire had fallen, right, up to the rise of the Komnenians, that could do just only so much, let's say, to revert the situation on the short term, not by, again, filling the gap with these allies, let's put it this way. Together with the maritime functionaries whose jurisdiction the Venetians would have not ever been subjected, the places, also very importantly, where they could freely exercise such trade, right? And such right, in theory, was valid for the entire Byzantine world, right, the entire empire. But in practice, we think that it would be limited to those places listed in the Crucibulla. They were fairly wide. Now we'll explain why also it was limited. These locations went from Syria to the extreme western provinces, and they were the principal commercial centers of the empire. Right? You wouldn't see, however, the Black Sea ports, right, of which Constantinople wanted to maintain the monopoly because of essentially the Ukrainian grain. Also, the islands of Crete and Cyprus that had sort of, let's say, Crete would become essentially the the vegetable garden of the Komnenian house, specifically Cyprus. St. Crete had also some additional strategic value, but they were open anyway to Venetian trade some years later. Now, there was just so much that the Venetians wanted, more than else, the control of the Silk Route. And here we are just before the First Crusade that would eventually allow the Italians to settle more prepotently in the Levantine ports. But the actual truth is that, as we've seen often, that they had always been there. Like the Venetians had very strong ties with Egypt historically. I mean, the same relics of St. Mark had been essentially brought from there to Venice, and he was, of course, her patron saint. And let's say this role of middleman of the Mediterranean now provided with ever greater military power, to the point of bullying essentially the local government, obliging them to open the markets, because now there was no way to connect yourself with international trade, especially the Mediterranean one, otherwise, without the Italian fleets. So it was really a blackmail in many ways, and the Venetians were just also not interested in land grabbing. They just wanted specific ports, making lots of money, and it was it, right? And they maintained essentially this policy for a very long time, in fact profiting enormously without involving themselves, not even after the Fourth Crusade, into some territorial issues, right? Yes, they would have, I get a point, like entire territories like Crete as a whole, but these do not have really much of a hinterland. And again, the Venetians didn't care. There was some sort of like feudal, say there were some local Venetian lords that would start, in fact, ruling over the local Byzantines even before the Fourth Crusade. But this were not the representatives of the Republic, that were instead looking at them sinisterly, because there was probably some official controlling the hinterland, the relations between the ports, the quarters, and the hinterland. And as you know, the Byzantines themselves would not maintain this good relations with the Venetians for long. But at the end of the day, either they would confer these privileges to other Italians, or they would essentially restore those, say, rights for, and also what they had stolen in the process, by the way, to keep mostly the same Venice, keep in the same role. The commercial privileges were no doubt the most important for Venice, because the exemptions granted to her made the Venetians obtaining a position of preeminence in the Eastern Mediterranean. Right? Venice had always had it, but now the thing was ever more structured, right? And this helped Venice in competition also with the Italian maritime republics. They had already acquired similar advantages in 992. We are at the time of Basil II, who in fact had issued a chrysobulla in favor of the Venetians. However, the concessions were narrower. Like, this was a simple reduction of the taxes for the ships arriving to Constantinople. Now, on the contrary, like lots of things had changed in 100 years, and the Venetians had a practically complete liberty of operating within the empire. And after such concessions, there was also the affirmation of a political dominion of some sort that naturally equated to the erosion of Byzantine power. The very interesting topic. We have to look at it a bit more in depth, but you can sort of understand the scale of such relations. At that point, there was no reason to evaluate the same risk, in the sense that, of course, in the moment in which these concessions had been granted, they were needed, right? The Byzantines had not decided to make a gift to Venice. They were simply doing so in order to obtain something in exchange. So, it was a deliberate choice. You can't say, oh, no, the Byzantines should have not done it. Because otherwise, the empire might have fallen much earlier. And, by the way, at this point, the volume of Venetian traffics was still, say, controllable, meaning that even if you were starting to depend in great part on it in relative terms, still there was a capacity from the side of the Byzantines to really impose themselves on the same Venetians every once in a while. Again, they do it at some point, expel them, even carry out massacres. There were lots of tensions between the Latins and the Greeks again. The idea is that as long as there is a strong Byzantine state, you have to be aware of their reaction of its government. It's not much the people, right? But in this sense, in fact, the Venetians come above the people and under the imperial authority, right? Because they are objectively more important. There were some, like at this point, it is another vexata question in Byzantine historiography, like how, say, what was really the potential of Byzantine society in terms of economical competitivity and whatever. Essentially very low compared at least to the Italian maritime republics that would always represent the gold standard for that. Like maybe in the 15th century you see some banks in the Byzantine Empire emerging, but they are essentially like, scarce, and they, at that point, the empire is crippled, and it's plenty of major Italian banks all around. So it's an interesting question, like this dirigistic attitude, saying if the Byzantines had dedicated themselves more, to Anatolia rather than Balkans, or if they had tried to maintain the central government instead of feudalizing, of privatizing. These are interesting questions you can pose yourself in the philosophy of history, but overall, like, you have to be consistent about the contingencies, because this is all about contingencies. Like, all these powers were sort of in pendulum, right? Just to quote Rudolf of Habsburg, for unrelated reasons, or actually connected exactly with this precarious balance that a polity of this time inherently had. So it was normal to bargain such things. Like what was at stake really was much more. We see this like tendentially. Still at this time, after all, they had it easy. Like nobody was seeing the fall of the empire coming. Really not. These were exactly times in which the Normans could have taken Constantinople. So it was more than like it's not that everything was going so well until 1204. Byzantine history is perhaps the best picture of this, actually of a very powerful polity that, however, was still constantly threatened in its existence from a certain time onwards. At least not literally all the time, but in this case, right, quite evidently. So this solution solves partially, at least the most pressuring Norman problem, right? So Alexios I had now to intervene on another theater, that is the Balkans, because the Pechenegs had even had a role against successfully expelling the Normans, were not to move. So in 1087, as it happened among all these populations that, as we've seen so often in Balkan history, this was already the case of the Bulgarians. Actually, the Bulgarians that were subjected by Basil II still at this point were backing the Pechenegs to launch these raids. In fact, in 1087 are launched deep into imperial territory, right, descending the valleys towards the Aegean that are the most fertile and hoping to loot, right, coming back. And there was an extra support, at least an ideological one, because we're still talking mostly about the Bulgarians, and I made a video exactly about this regarding the Bogomils, right, and the threat that they had posed in a sort of populistic, of course, gnostically heretic, in fact, Antioch's already sense when the first Bulgarian Empire was still standing. These were the Catars in many ways, the same dualistic heretics that had denied incarnation. They, you can check the other videos. There is a medieval heresies and heterodoxy playlist that you can check out. And this Manichaean sect was first of all very spread in the Balkans. They had come probably from further east, from the so-called Paulicians. The way they were called was after the Bulgarian priest Bogomil that had founded at least that specific sort of Balkan group, or at least had become more important. This would say these heresies had always kind of remained out there from late antiquity. Like in the 11th century, you have this revival of economy, of literacy, of contacts in general. So you have the reactivation of some of these Pelasgian ideas, and the Bogomils were so horrifying that they would actually push the same Byzantines to carry out a crusade later on during the Komnenian era. In fact, I talk about it in some of the videos. Something that was completely alien, as we will see now, however, up to that point, to the Byzantine mentality. Right? The Byzantines would never carry out crusades except for this, let's say, crusade. It's not a copy of the Western model. It's just like a holy war directed to a specific sect, in a military sense too, because they were grappled, as we've seen, in the Balkan mountains, and so it required some proper extermination. In 1087, the Byzantines were still fairly exhausted, so Alexios just had to negotiate with the Pechenegs. But this did not help solving, in fact, the situation for good, and these people allied themselves with the Turkish emir of Smyrna, that essentially posed a vital threat to the same Constantinople in winter 1090-1091. Essentially, the Pechenegs and the Seljuks besieged the Byzantine capital, right? Striking thus at the as a new threat at the heart of the same state. Alexios at this point recurs to yet another proof of the usual diplomatic skill of the Byzantine legacy. He counterposed to the Pechenegs as their allies the nomadic people of the Cumans that were quite akin to them. It's practically even impossible to distinguish them. I have a video about some Kazakh horsemen, but that during the same period, but it could fit essentially just like a Pecheneg or a Cuman horse as well. These guys came from, again, the Eurasian steppes, today's Russia, and the Pechenegs were essentially defeated by the Cumans. Thanks to that, movements of peoples across this Eurasian steppes corridor, one turn against the other. The advantage of this option was that and the Byzantines were literally the people who knew it best and everybody else, that every time you knocked out one of these nomadic peoples, there was always another one coming from the steppe. Always. Like, that's a certainty, just like Death herself. So at that point, it was better just to actually exploit the thing. So buying time while these guys were killing each other for their pastures and for the bases from which they could launch raids for their usual loot, rape, and massacre. Pretty cute, charming, exotic cultures we're discussing. Now, there was this, by the way, this clash was really, it took place, right? The Byzantines sent their own troops. It was a great battle fought in the spring of 1091, close to the Livonian mountain at the Maritsa river mouth. At the same time, Alexios managed to trigger a revolt against the emir of Smyrna. That in this from the same Anatolia, because you know that the Seljuk emirates were pretty competitive with one another. Like, was the Sultanate of Economy was the largest thing with these on the fringe, right? You could really play in so many of these smaller powers. I just recently made multiple videos on the Seljuks. There is something incoming as well, so I love how we managed to always make some relevant connection, not just with, of course, the many videos I already uploaded even maybe years ago, but just at a, I don't know, month distance or even less. The consequence of, by the way, the Turkish infight was that the Emir of Smyrna had to abandon the siege of Constantinople. So in other words, Alexios successfully kept out these invaders and saved the same Constantinople. Right, this was a great success. Also, the one against the Normans. I mean, the guy managed to pull that off, in spite the defeat at Iraq and and the invasion of the same Byzantine heartland. So it's a big deal. The guy was just like a hero, like a typical man at arms of his times, right? We will perhaps analyze at some point. We surely do. Actually, I made already some videos about Byzantine heavy cavalry and cataphracts between the 10th and 11th century. But you never end really talking about the equipment in some arms and armor video. So this settlement, right, especially the fact that the Cumans that had allied themselves with the Byzantines against the Pechenegs were in turn defeated by the same Byzantines, as we were pointing out before, like, were just the same scumbag, had stabilized the European part of the empire, like the western part. And this was a big deal because, at least in order to reconquer Anatolia, you had probably to launch quite aimed offensive at reconquering the hinterland, hopefully knocking out the Sultan of Iconium. This was not possible yet. While the West, as threatened as it was still essentially within, for many reasons, within probably the Byzantine world. It had a broader landmass, and now the Komnenians, of course, had to quite rely on that, even though, as you know, strategically they would concentrate mostly from the largely successful reconquest of Anatolia, right, until Myriokephalon. And if the empire had survived, if there had not been a fourth crusade, likely, they would have had still the resources to even come back again in the east. Anyhow, the Turks in Asia Minor were really on the Byzantine radar, right? They were really an objective. That now had the resources of taking on, right? There was a sort of precarious truce with the wall bloc, right? There were some, again, Seljuk, some Turkish lords that were sort of allies with the Byzantines. At some point, even the Komnenians themselves would marry with some Muslim. But the possibility of turning more seriously towards Anatolia was thwarted by the other big deal of the situation. You really don't have an easy job as a Byzantine emperor. That is to say, just a little thing like, the First Crusade, So a mass of, rough, violent, avid, Western elite cavalrymen that just, will pass by to take this camping around Constantinople, and you will have just to push them away across the Bosphorus, hopefully getting them the hell out of, as far away as possible, even though, it wasn't that simple either, right? The Crusade, again, I have lots of videos now on the First Crusade, but I don't think I have made anything very much in detail about the campaign or something. So, to make long story short, the Crusade was launched in 1095. Urban II at the Council of Clermont-Ferrand launched this appeal in defense of, technically, property of the Byzantines, right, of the Eastern Christians that had been threatened by the infidels. The major deal had been the Seljuk conquest of Jerusalem back in the 70s. And telling the truth, the Seljuks were, by this point, were not even just much of a, expansive power. They had immediately fragmented. Actually, the pilgrimage to Constantinople, to Jerusalem, that had initially been prohibited by the Turks, had been reactivated, and this Seljuk invasion had contributed to actually organize better even the pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The Normans, in many ways, had worked themselves as contractors to escort the pilgrims there, and it was a greater connection, as we've seen, even with the Italian control of Mediterranean fort, the proper, capacity of strategical and logistical projection towards the Levant. Right, this was a good moment. Like the Byzantines themselves had been asking for the West for essentially Western mercenaries, right, Frankish mercenaries that had already been around. I mean, essentially from the Viking era to the sort of the Norman one, or you can't even distinguish anymore with the divide between whichever Western guy that had been fighting out there in the east. At the Battle of Manzikert were Normans from the Byzantine side. So these are all things we will see more in depth some other time. Because again, the Normans settled even in places like, I don't know, northern Anatolia on their own, that's also in the Balkans. That's sort of an overlooked part of, in fact, their expansion. In any case, the Byzantines had not contemplated such a thing like a joint Western military expedition, and even less one organized by the Pope. That the major leaders of Western Christendom at this point were either excommunicated or busy killing each other, and so this would be the Crusade of the Barons. Admittedly, there were people like, as we'll see now, the same brother of the King of France, etc. In any case, for the Byzantines, it was completely inconceivable the fact that an ecclesiastical authority could literally send its own divisions, right, out there. The Byzantines had a quite strongly Caesaro-papistic sense of themselves, right, as the emperor as the head of the church, the latter which had nothing to do with military exploit. This is yet again one of the radical divides between Western and Eastern Christendom. The appeal of the Pope triggered an enormous enthusiasm. Right, Europe was really ready to start this great epoch, and the adhesion to the enterprise went, in fact, even probably beyond Urban II's expectations. The great movement of people that was its consequence, this first expedition, however, was seen, as we explained, with surprise, but also legitimate worry by the Byzantine world as a whole, because essentially you had a Western army to cross unavoidably the Byzantine territory, and most of the routes were terrestrial at this point. It's only from the Third Crusade that things go a bit more standardly maritime, right? And it's also what we said, that the same idea of crusade as it had been conceived in the West in 1095 was not really the first start of this. It had been going on from quite a while, was so distant from the Byzantine mentality, right? The idea was paradoxically that the Byzantines had always been into this sort of cosmic struggle ever since Islam had come around. The emperors, as the leaders of the same church, were to just perennially struggle, right? We're probably into a continuous fight. Ideally, of course, in every one of their action for the sublimity of their role against any infidel, right? So there was an exclusive duty just in fighting Islam for the Byzantines, and so what they had been doing as a polity that, of course, could not simply take out Islam from the face of the entire earth, had to pragmatically sort of accept that series of compromises and not responding, however, to another authority, the ecclesiastical one, that in the West had arisen instead, and I have a video incoming on the Gregorian reforms, as a true monarchy that was sort of supportive but also competitive, were not conflictual with the emperors, with the Roman emperors, for especially their shortcomings. And so this idea of the Pope simply launching a campaign also, that was a big deal in the West for the same lay authorities, that could not intervene, as we've seen, and so they felt sort of the need to increase, actually, to eventually participate, to take the reins of the expeditions. That's what happens during the Second Crusade, as disastrously as it would, however. So cultural differences, ideological differences aside, in material terms, the movement of a great quantity of troops from the West was really an alarming news for Constantinople. Nobody knew really what they would behave like, right? This situation had never produced itself, really. The Westerners, in the Byzantine eyes, had always been looked upon with suspicion. Look at the recent Norman invasion, really the scariest. The main characteristics, stereotypically, of the Latins were arrogance, avidity, incapacity of respecting treatises. This was actually, pretty much some characteristics were thought of the Byzantines by the same Westerners, by the way. The Byzantines, as also, for example, Anna Komnena would describe, were considered very powerful, militarily speaking. The Byzantines made no mystery of that, nor the Muslims, for that matter. The Westerners were, yes, so unruly, cocky, arrogant, violent, whatever, but when they mounted on horseback and carried out those cavalry charges, they were really something, right? This is something that the Byzantines say since the 6th century in the Strategicon, in the part on the so-called blonde-haired peoples, that these guys behaved as if they were literally, they said, the only ones who had in the world to have courage. In any case, they were dangerous and really unpredictable, which is, again, true for most peoples in many ways. There was a sense that, yes, of course, there were some more civilized peoples you could deal with, but the point with the West, it was in tumultuous expansion, and so also its political fragmentation rendered everything much riskier, as we've seen for Constantinople. And Alexius did communicate in all this with the Pope, right? They both decided as the gathering point of the Crusaders that would have, entailed also the participation of the same Alexius, in theory, to the expedition. This was, in fact, just suspicious condition that the Pope had put, and that Alexius feared, because the question is, I may go out there and be surrounded by these Westerners. Instead, the Byzantines remained within the city gates. There was the concrete possibility, of course, of them sort of attacking the same Constantinople. There were throughout the Crusades, aside from, say, the moments of open warfare, like even during formally amicable relations, skirmishes with the local authorities, the Byzantines engaging, sometimes the Crusaders, and also regularly sabotaging them, telling the truth, even when they granted the passage. There was not much that Alexius could do in the first place to stop this expedition. Right? He, after all, had sort of called for this help. Now it was arriving. He couldn't really say no, unless he would have showed like bad faith against the Westerners that could have constituted a casus belli for the same against the Byzantines or something like that. So the cooperation with Rome in this was a failure, because it's the Pope who literally dictated the conditions, as the Byzantines did not have the material capacity to oppose themselves to this. And the ultimate purpose was the cooperation of in the war against the Turks. So there was a valid reason, after all, for sending these troops, and the First Crusade would essentially succeed in that. The official expedition, constituted by feudal lords, was accompanied, as we know, and preceded by a spontaneous expedition of pilgrims, the so-called People's Crusade. Also made a video about this, that in fact occurred like some month before. The People's Crusade was organized after the Council of Clermont by the work of numerous preachers that were also quite autonomous in this endeavor. Among them, as you know, the very famous Peter the Hermit, this itinerant monk, emerged, came to lead the same expedition. I made recently a video about pilgrimage in medieval France that deals even with the background of such figures and how many people moved, right, for reasons of pilgrimage, visiting relics and participating to these other, say, greater events. The Crusades gave an important boost to such movement and aggregations. Peter the Hermit was originary of Amiens in Picardy, northeastern France, and he had began to preach the crusade in his country, where he gathered 15,000 followers. He passed then to Germany, reaching the Rhineland, that would have eventually connected him with the Danubian Valley, and that was essentially the main route to Constantinople. All right. As we know, this movement triggered some religious extremism. For example, the first large anti-Jewish pogroms in the West were carried out at this point. Actually, the ecclesiastical authorities were quite frustrated with this, because these were just, like, you see, pilgrims, as we'll see now, very poor people, putting together the expedition. The bishops cared instead about order and everything. The Jews were historically, let's say, integrated in the lay as well as in the ecclesiastical administration. The same bishops, of course, unseated their swords to defend the Jews from this rabble of people who essentially wanted to do what they were accusing the Jews of, essentially stealing money, the money that the Jews had collected, just because they were kindly thought to be condemned to hell anyway, and so that kind of office could be, carried out materially by them in Christian world. This is also an oversimplification of how things really work, but really the sense that the people, the populace, fundamentally, just like today, like Wood does, support this nonsense of Palestine being free. Communists, lesser people, properly the scum of our society. The elite always supports a rigid hierarchy in which the Jews were historically integrated, by the way, with the ultimate purpose of being witness to the veridicity of Christianity in the end times, right? Whereas the other non-Christians could be taken out fundamentally. In any case, we will talk about those things as well. And in Germany too, there was this great enthusiasm amidst this turbulences. Lots of other disciples were recruited by Peter the Hermit, who was keep on preaching. And to his following, you could have witnessed this really heterogeneous multitude of people. Also women and children. This was really normal, also just in regular armies, but in this case, it was really the People's Crusade, right? There were sort of randos that had gotten there for the most different reasons. They were all probably like passion of Peter's preaching. Like, we don't have to, in fact, Manichaeanly and so heretically separate the two things. It was always some sort of compenetration, but in many ways these people were very indisciplined and also very poorly organized from a strictly military point of view. The bulk of them was constituted by peasants that saw in the crusade a way to abandon the misery of their everyday life. There were also disinherited noblemen, adventurers, criminals, you name them. Peter the Hermit reached Cologne with this rabble on April the 12th, 1096, and left from the same city some days later with the aforementioned plan of reaching Constantinople through Europe, like the continental route, right? So the let's say imagine this multitude also proceeding in different separated groups to some extent. For example, from the bulk of the expedition, there were some thousands of Frenchmen guided by Gauthier Saint-Savoir. That was yet another sort of spiritual figure that, as you understand here, mixed some, pauperistic evangelical instances. We've seen them very often in the also heterodox movements of Christianity at this point. Like, it was all then what Europe had been boiling with like in the previous generations in many ways, and they essentially went on their own. They left Cologne on April the 15th, and they being followed only after a few days by Peter the Hermit's people. The pilgrims crossed Hungary. That was also not particularly happy, of course, of this mass arriving there. It seems that the Hungarians and the Bulgarians were particularly rude, right? Some said that they were worse than the Turks, because also in part they had some, step bias within them, and some groups of these pilgrims were also ambushed, killed, and so on. But it was a serious thing at the international level. I mean, the King of Hungary had to deal with the passage of this guy, speeding mostly that up, like giving them food to get the hell out, right? Not bivouacking into the Carpathian Basin, just like making them pass as quickly as possible. The frontier with the Byzantine Empire was reached at Belgrade, and this mass began to essentially devastate and sack. Right? There was an evident difference in the way they had behaved in the Western Christendom and within the Byzantine Empire. Like when they entered in the latter, they felt more, in the spirit of looting and, being a bit more antipathetic. The Byzantine authorities, by the way, couldn't really do much because the Balkan frontier had been just underpopulated. The garrisons were not enough to stop this mass, so there was nothing that the same Alexios could do at that point. The hope was that the emperor would send some troops, but this was not really happening. And in the meanwhile, the forces of Gauthier Saint-Savoy, that were very poorly organized and logistically, so they were always in search for food, for forage, sacked the same surroundings of Belgrade, where they were met by the Byzantine forces as well. And there was a very strong contrast, at the end of which, however, diplomacy worked out a deal for which the Byzantine commanders had enough to properly resupply and escort up to Constantinople the people's crusade, where the latter arrived without further accidents towards the mid of July, to be cautiously and reasonably lodged outside the city walls, right? As eventually all the crusaders that followed them would, historically. That was really the best way. Like, they were out there in the open, were relatively exposed to the same Byzantines, and yes, they could threaten the same city, but at least in theory they were in amicable terms. With Peter's people, the situation was even more grim, right? The Latins essentially sacked an Hungarian city. They broke through the Sava River by force, and they devastated Belgrade. This was the bulk of the People's Crusade. They were not particularly organized, as we will see now. The first crusade is probably the crusade of the barons. That was a very and fiercely orderly expedition by probably the military professionals, some of the finest blood of Europe, that were very well organized and everything. These guys instead were literally just acting by force of their mass, right, in an incredibly unregulated way. In Belgrade, they also again met with the Byzantine forces. There were clashes again. The Byzantines were not able. There was all this political ambiguity. What happens if we wipe them out? The Pope will maybe turn the Crusaders entirely against us. Just a way to try to let them pass without trying to avoid the greatest devastation. The People's Crusade disorderly reached Sofia, and they were finally reached by Alexios' envoys that in fact took care of the supplies and escorted them to Constantinople. They reached the capital essentially a couple of weeks after the first, say, the vanguard of Gautier Saint-Savoie. We are on August the 1st, 1096. Alexius tried in all this, of course, to keep under control this rabble. But even in front of Constantinople, they began to devastate the suburbs of the city. And after a week, Alexius was forced to ship these guys across the Bosphorus, because really the situation was becoming unsustainable. In spite of Alexius' advice to avoid prosecuting across the route to the Holy Land without the support of regular forces, the People's Crusade advanced disorderly into the Anatolian hinterland. And you know what happened there, right? And it's nice to think that Alexius had even told them, like, look, wait for the rest of your forces. So the Byzantines were up to some degree of cooperation and advice, but they, again, especially this part of the Westerners did not have really the intelligence to appreciate the general sense. We're a bunch of fanatics in many ways, and in fact, in spite of some initial success against some Muslim outposts, on October the 21st, 1096, the People's Crusade was virtually annihilated in a great open field engagement. Among the dead there was also Gautier Saint-Savoie, while famously Peter the Hermit managed to escape, because at the moment of the defeat he was already in Constantinople, where he had gone, even though he had left the city, to seek for further help, supplies, to the same Alexios Komnenos. This tells you, like, of course, a lot about, like Grandman's advice: do not go out there without covering to Seljuk territory. Like, that's the 11th century vibe of the situation. And a very different picture was the one of the Barons' Crusade, the real one. The feudal lords began to arrive in Constantinople at different waves from the last months of 1096. So essentially we're spending the cold season in Constantinople. Sort of made sense, because again, there wasn't like a general lay direction, right, like it would happen for the later Crusades. It was a king ruling them, so they were coming in pockets, but there were some of the finest forces, and we do not know, like, I will not digress on the quite thankless job of trying to calculate how many they were, but there were a pretty large force altogether. Naturally, there weren't only knights. These guys had brought lots of other people with them that were, and others had just followed them along the way in similar ways, also from similar backgrounds from one of the People's Crusade. They would work as sutler, just field aides, and you can imagine the merchants all around. There had been some tensions here and there, but it was a much more orderly business, and these were the guys who were truly like up to like a serious fight, right, and thinking a bit more strategic way after all. The majority of the Latins had crossed the sea into the empire from Bari, that, as you know, was essentially a Greek city, a prominent center of Byzantine administration until the Normans, in fact, had taken it over. So this is close to the Otranto Strait, and so a good port to, like the other was Brindisi for that matter, for reaching, in fact, Dyrrhachium, following on the steps of the same Normans, as you understand, logistically as a route from 15 years before, and some were the same people, as we will see now. And from Dyrrhachium, they would continue along the Egnatia road, like existing since Roman times, notoriously connecting, like crossing the entire Balkans, right from longitudinally, reaching Constantinople. Some knights, however, as Godfrey of Bouillon, that was the same Duke of Low Lorraine, so we're talking about the higher nobility. Think about, I don't know, Raymond of Saint-Gilles, the Count of Toulouse, preferred the terrestrial itinerary as well. There were different routes. It's sort of obvious, at least for some, because if you lived in Lower Lorraine, you were actually part of Germany, right? So reaching the Rhine, and then from there the Danube, it was the easiest way. Raymond of Saint-Gilles, as we will learn better later, would have, just being on the Mediterranean, better off with a maritime expedition, but he was enemy with the Hauteville of Sicily, so he preferred to skip the maritime option and passing on their territory. So there are, of course, political reasons as well. Now, the first to arrive to Constantinople, interestingly enough, was Hugh of Vermandois. There was the aforementioned brother of the king of the Western Franks, Philip I. I would like to point out that Philip was named like this because he was half Rus, right? His mother, Anne of Kiev, had brought the name Philip, otherwise not used in Latin Germanic Europe since antiquity, because she thought that this name from the Macedonian feudal nobility was quite fitting with the mental obsession of the Western Franks with everything horse related. So, of course, Philip was a Greek name and had arrived in Kiev through the Byzantine evangelization of the Rus. So it's something we were talking about the other day for the Principality of Kiev. Right, just for pointing out, as we were discussing the other day in terms also of the Varangians, right, that actually the connections, with, for example, the arms and armor of the Rus were imported from the West in great numbers, and there was much greater connection between the Rus and the West than we tend to think, right? And this was yet another way the Byzantines were feeling outpowered in many ways. So the same Duke of Vermandois was, part of the same blood. The last knights to arrive were Robert the Duke. We're talking about the most important guys, of course. Robert the Duke of Normandy, his brother-in-law Stephen, the Count of Blois. I made a video about the Duke or the Duchy of Normandy and the County of Blois. We are in the first days of May of 1097. As we were saying, also with these barons there were issues, like there were sacks, incidents with the Byzantines, some seriousness. I mean, these guys killed each other in the process, but Alexios I, as we saw, avoided to just generalize a hostile, to formalize a hostile attitude, limiting himself to act with diplomacy to just reduce the damage that would have occurred anyway. There was nothing you could do to avoid it in absolute terms, just to reduce it in relative ones. He, of course, was very double with them too, right? He wanted to reach this sort of operational agreement, just making these guys cross the Bosphorus and sending them away from Constantinople. So while these knights were arriving on the Bosphorus with their respective retinues, the Latin chiefs were obliged to perform essentially an oath of fealty to Alexios. This is fascinating because, say, an oath of fealty was a very Western thing, and Alexios naturally knew what the Westerners were about, and he acted according to their customs. After all, that he posed himself as a great feudal lord, right? That these not even noblemen were sort of willing because of his magnificency. I mean, he was the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. It was a huge deal. This guy's fiefs were smaller, of course, and this allowed, of course, like, it was acting a bit like the great boss, right? You know, that would help these guys for crossing, was blessing them and helping and whatever. But it also entailed, in virtue of the same oath of fealty, the duty and actually the position of restoration to the Byzantine Empire of all the cities that had previously belonged to the Romans when they would have been reconquered. Right. So in other words, we know how things went evidently, but the idea was that these crusaders would have passed by Constantinople, and and in virtue of this oath, they would have simply extended the Byzantine Empire. Right. So trying to act as if to make them act from the Byzantine side as if there were those mercenaries that the same Alexios and other rulers had been asking the West to counter the Muslims on their eastern frontier. Immediately after this oath, the Latins were shipped across the Bosphorus. Their logistical base would be a locality on the way of Nicomedia to avoid essentially the reunion of, say, too many armed contingents under the Theodosian walls, right? They were shipped gradually as, like, I don't know, in the purgatory, like, you do this, go, you can let pass. And in this way, the Byzantines avoided this enormous force to simply think to make 2 + 2, as many of them were probably already planning, and take Constantinople by force of numbers. Alexios I, in exchange, of course, was promising different stuff. For example, to take on the cross in his own turn, so essentially to participate as a crusader, to provide logistical support, which had sort of been happening in spite of all the issues. The Byzantines would poison the wheat, like the floor, this kind of things, like, and to provide also with some auxiliary force, right? Some Byzantine troops to support the Crusaders. And at least formally, the agreement was satisfactory because Alexios was evidently just trying to act nicely to avoid the worst case scenario. The reality was just a very fragile agreement based more on reciprocal distrust than on the real will to cooperate, right? After all, the Crusaders were really motivated by by pious intentions. They did not want to die by the hand of, say, the Byzantines, just because of this disagreements, while they had, say, committed themselves so much to the holy enterprise. Nor the Byzantines wanted to die by the hands of these brutes, that were also quite fascinating. I mean, some of the most beautiful passages from Anna Komnena, that was so, thrilled by these Franks, right, by Bohemond of Taranto, tells you a lot about how, the fascination, after all, the Byzantines had always had ethnographically for different peoples, right? Who were these Westerners, right? Because legitimately they knew each other. There were Europeans, there were contacts, whatever. But let's say a guy from Belgium or, I don't know, Aquitaine, it was not so often seen around. I mean, yeah, the Normans of southern Italy were technically just people from France, from Germany, from northern Italy, but the general sense is that they were now for the first time in arms and coping with the Byzantines in a much more direct way, and just also now not so far away from the Great Schism, right? So technically led by the Pope into this enterprise. That was yet another enormous deal in the relations between Constantinople and Rome. The reciprocal will to cooperate was showed also by the signatures left by the knights. And among these there was the Norman Bohemond, the son of the Saint Robert Guiscard, that, as we've seen just 15 years before, had actually gone to war with his father to the empire. The request of an oath was not fully standardized, meaning that it was generally speaking accepted, and in spite of the general resistance of some barons that did not want to bow there. I mean, these were incredibly, proud people, right? At home, their kings barely had the control on them. In general, not, let's say, promising this act of fealty was just complicating the march. There was something about Byzantine autocracy that had to be imposed on this guy in a way or another. It was, after all, in concrete terms, very few, right? It was at least this sense from the Byzantine side, of course, that if you were not to fulfill this oath, God would have not helped you in some way. So there was, from this kind of traditional mentality in the West, the awareness of the fact that there was something like honor at stake. In fact, some of the most important leaders of the expedition managed to circumnavigate this problem. Tancred of Hauteville, the nephew of Bohemond of Taranto, arrived in Anatolia without passing through Constantinople, right? Just with means of his own. And Raymond of Saint-Gilles categorically refused to make such oath, and he accepted only to swear to respect the person of Alexios I, like a peer, not as a leader of some sort. So it was like I treat you as a knight rather than else. There was, in this sense, a facilitation, given that this guy was, as we've seen, rival with the Hauteville. They were the greatest threat to the Byzantines, and that simply bypassed with Tancred at least this oath, right? Passage to Constantinople, and basically cross that land without asking permission to anyone. That is quite telling. Towards the end of April of 1097, the bulk of the Crusader forces left their encampments in Constantinople. There were still some contingents that had to arrive, but they said, okay, well, who cares, like, we'll join later. Thus they entered in Anatolia, right? And also for them, like, everything went smoothly at the beginning. Also because Alexios provided them with the support promised, obtaining the restitution, for example, of Nicaea and other minor towns. This was important because, you know, these guys had proven to be, like, they had to pass through, you know, in a way or another. There was no way to, at that time, to really make a naval expedition to Palestine, and the general say strategic interests of the Crusaders by reasons of major force overlapped with the Byzantines, and so the latter, when this was the case, would not lesinate resources, right, to supply the Crusaders, right, and especially in such close places, Nicaea is in front of Constantinople practically, so this would have, say that the Crusaders realistically would not come that far in such large number just to entrench themselves in Nicaea, right? So just today we do not talk about the Crusader perspective, but strategically and logistically what they managed to pull off in the First Crusade was nothing short of miraculous, right? It was truly like a holy enterprise. There was, of course, a parallel Byzantine activity, right? Byzantine forces took, in parallel to the Crusaders, control of part of Western Anatolia, contributing also to consolidate the rear of the Latin expedition, so widening properly the control of the hinterland in the West. These were, again, the most important centers were on the coasts, but the valleys, right, leading to those, like the various towns, the fortifications, they were important, right, and conquering those was objectively also helping the Crusaders get better supplies, etc. However, the Byzantine Crusader cooperation began to deteriorate as soon as the Crusaders made their first permanent conquests, giving no sign whatsoever to be willing to return these to the Byzantine Emperor. We're talking specifically, like, the first one is the county of Edessa in March 1098. This was not given back to the Byzantines, and some months later, the same Antioch marked, like, the definitive break between the Crusaders and Constantinople. Antioch was really very important for the Byzantine policy. I mean, Jerusalem in general was, of course, the holy city, and the most important prize, right, that the Byzantines could take back, but it was also a place that had been relatively more distant from the Romans for a longer time. Antioch instead had been up to recently in Byzantine hands. The Turks had essentially occupied it. It was a strong Christian presence, and also probably a Byzantine one in terms of the population of people who had been living there. We have seen this also in some videos about Syrian warfare for our regional warfare introductions. It's reflected in the local militia system, etc. It was also a big city, like just the most important Syrian one. And this was conquered, in fact, after an 8-month siege, it was a very famous one during the First Crusade, by the same Bohemond of Taranto, who thus established a Norman principality in Syria, like in the most important Byzantine city there. Consider the power of the Siculo-Normans at this point. They had southern Italy, Sicily, various territories. I remember one of the very first videos of Schwerpunkt was dedicated to like the sum of power. So Corfu, even an important dominion, the influence that was exercised in North Africa, the Principality of Antioch, right? So these were all bases that were sort of surrounding the Aegean, and in fact, sort of choking Constantinople. This one of Antioch was probably the most important affront. Well, at least southern Italy had been the major deal, but of course also the invasion of the Byzantine Empire. But Antioch was, as far as the eastern policy of Constantinople, like a matter of being Byzantine. Like the Westerners had never had anything to do with that historically, and now they were even establishing a principality in there, plus with the papacy that Constantinople had broken with from a couple of generations, and this incredibly successful, like universal coordination of moral forces, of military power. Like this was insane. Like Europe was really striking hard back after centuries of gradual formation of some restoring of internal statal institutions and so on. I made a video about the Siculo-Norman, not the Italo-Norman horsemen, right, of this time, and like there we explain more or less what these guys were about in a general sense. Of course, the Byzantines did ask Bohemond, that had actually promised to give this territory back to the emperor, to do the same, and it was a simple refusal. The Normans were quite practical people. So the Crusades, like I say, the Crusaders' field also split in a way. It was, as we've seen, this inherent rivalry between Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond of Taranto. Alexios had allowed Raymond to, as we've seen, avoid even to make this oath of allegiance, so had tried to elevate this guy among the other crusaders as the only one that did not need to subject even the Roman emperor, which from a Byzantine perspective is a quite universal exception. Except the Hauteville were really the most popular among the crusaders. I mean, legends about the Normans of southern Italy being Poulain, right, mixed with the Muslims, the same Greeks that were at least exposed to them, their cultural influence, would see it as a sort of, soften up, strange, vile, cunning. The Hauteville had been adventurers who were really nobodies in perspective. So the French, the German crusaders would see normally these guys a bit as, what the hell are they? But within the context of the First Crusade, actually, just by the fact this blood had conquered that vast region of southern Italy, with all the the massive resources, the agricultural ones, the passage, in fact, for the passages for the Holy Land, as well as the contact, the routes for the east, territories that had previously belonged to the Byzantine Emperor, and plus the papal blessing. These were really the heroes of the situation, right? And Bohemond was treated as such by the other crusader, right? He was seen as that guy. And so most crusaders defended the rights of the Norman, right? That very cleverly and shrewdly was also insinuating among the same crusaders that Alexius was plotting for actually betraying the same crusaders. And he was not wrong, by the way, because the Byzantines were always trying to sort of, trying to inflict losses to their rivals. And as we've seen also at operational logistical level, most Byzantine support had really stopped. Then you know how the story went. Again, today we talk about the Byzantines, but most obviously the Crusaders marched towards Jerusalem. At that point, they probably didn't give a damn about Constantinople anymore. Alexios Komnenos couldn't do anything else but adapting to what happened. Right, the presence of a Siculo-Norman principality in Antioch, which represented again a dramatic threat. In fact, there would be an open war with the empire and Bohemond that would drag on until 1108. Right, so it actually did end positively for the Byzantines, because Bohemond, just like his father, and as he had done back in the day, fought again in the Iraqian, but this time being defeated by the imperial forces. As a consequence, now this would deserve an important digression on how the balance of power in Europe, in Levant, etc. was all intertwined. Bohemond of Taranto had to proclaim himself a vassal of Alexius I. The Principality of Antioch, however, was run by Tancred of Hauteville, that in turn would refuse, of course, to give it back to the emperor. That also never really tried to do so, but this is something that we have seen in perspective. I already made a video about John II. And so again, we were actually, I think we completed the Komnenians, if not, yes, I think so. Like for this series at least, we will of course talk extensively and intensively about the Komnenians, but in something a bit more, in depth, unless we start doing something like biographies of the most sort of important rulers, perhaps, or other key figures of medieval history. It's something I've been sort of thinking from quite a while. I'm just not sure yet. Right. I'm glad, of course, to see the new subscribers, etc. Just we have to speed up a little, because at this rate we can have even a substantial amount of subscribers, but we have to aim at something bigger. Right. Let's try to make things viral, considering all the videos that I uploaded. Strange things are happening with the algorithm. It's not that they are negative in absolute terms, but they're still strange, Let's try to boost the channel in any possible way, and I can keep delivering these videos. And again, even if they're there's this voice that is spreading that I make just introductions, right? it's not really true, as you see, but not in this video. But I mean, the introductions are necessary because they're part of a cycle that can last years, has been lasting years as a matter of fact, and they're necessary because only on the basis of those you can eventually discuss and further other stuff. And that my introductions are basically exponentially more in-depth videos than the sort of in-depth videos that on the same topic that other channels do, right? So this video on Alexius is didn't talk too much about his government, but again, I have in fact already done something. We'll keep doing something, but this is also literally the most important thing prospectively that happened in his reign, right? And again, hopefully we'll talk about the the Komnenians soon. We will talk also about the haute ville. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.